And thank you for your patience. I appreciate it. As you know, we have votes, and the votes take precedence over everything. And I just take note, colleagues, that our former member, Madame Normandine, had her baby. Yeah. Leopold. That's right. Sounds like a Belgian prince. No, not a good idea. Not a good connection there. No. It just does show you, though, that this is the most productive committee on the Hill. No. Oh, every once in a while it happens. Yeah. So with that, we have three witnesses today. Arlene Beauchamp, Gary Good, and Colonel retired David Salisbury. I'm just going to call you in the order that I've mentioned you, 5 minutes each, and I'll look forward to Ms. Beauchamp for 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Good afternoon, members of the Standing Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to address this critical issue regarding the national defense and Canadian Armed Forces current and legacy contaminated sites. My name is Eileen Beauchamp, and I'm here today to share my personal connection to this issue. My father, a Korean War veteran, served in the Canadian Armed Forces from 1951 to 1975, including at CFB Gagetown during the 1960s. Our family lived in PMQs at CFB Gagetown from 1962 to 1969, participating in recreational activities. Many of these activities occurred in areas later identified as spray zones for harmful chemicals, including Agent Orange. Tragically, my family has endured severe health challenges over the years, including multiple cancers and other illnesses. Throughout my lifetime, I have been diagnosed with multiple illnesses related to the endocrine system, including autoimmune diseases. In November 2017, I was diagnosed with 3 individual cancers: melanoma, breast cancer, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is a recognized presumptive illness linked to chemical exposure. This experience is not unique. Countless other military personnel, veterans, families, and civilians with ties to CFB Gagetown have faced similar struggles and illnesses. CFB Gagetown's contamination history spans decades. From 1956 to 2004, extensive herbicide spraying has been conducted, involving chemicals like Agent Orange, numerous other dioxins, DDT, including present-day use of glyphosates. Many of these harmful chemicals, especially dioxins, are known carcinogens. While the 2005 fact-finding project investigated some of these exposures, significant gaps remain. The focus was predominantly on Agent Orange applications in 1966 and 1967, despite evidence of chemical spraying occurring before and after these years. Between 1956 and 1984, over 6,500 barrels of harmful chemicals were sprayed on approximately 181,000 acres, with minimal attention given to broader environmental and health impacts. Analytical methodologies omitted crucial factors, such as measuring dioxins in fatty tissue of consumed species, where these toxins accumulate. The fact-finding project addressed some contamination concerns but left critical gaps. It largely overlooked the chronological and environmental scope of exposure, limiting its ability to identify all affected individuals and long-term impacts. In 2007, a one-time ex gratia payment program was implemented. However, the sunset clause ended claims in December 2011, excluding individuals who later developed illnesses. Discrepancies between DND and Veterans Affairs in recognizing and compensating illnesses of exposure have added confusion and frustration for claimants. The Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory does not fully capture the scope of legacy contamination at CFB Gagetown. This lack of integration prevents effective tracking of exposure-related health outcomes, undermining efforts to study long-term impacts and offer support to affected military personnel, veterans, families, and civilians. Through advocacy efforts with groups like Brats in the Battlefield and learning from international practices, I have identified potential solutions. The U.S. PACT Act. This legislation provides expanded benefits to veterans exposed to toxic substances, streamlining healthcare and compensation. Canada could adopt a similar framework to improve support systems. Studies like the New Zealand Massey University study of Vietnam veterans revealed genetic and multi-generational effects of exposure, emphasizing the importance of sustained research and policy updates. The legacy of contamination at CFB Gagetown has left a profound mark on military families, veterans, and civilians. These individuals deserve recognition, accountability, and justice. Addressing these challenges requires an integrated, compassionate, and forward-thinking approach. I urge the committee to prioritize this issue, fostering transparency, better support systems, and legislative solutions to address contamination at CFB Gagetown and beyond. Thank you for your attention. I am pleased to answer your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Beauchamp. Mr. Good, 5 minutes, please.
Good day, committee members, and thank you for inviting me to testify before you here today in regards to the Department of National Defense's current and legacy contaminated sites. I'm proud to be testifying today on behalf of the Brats in the Battlefield and all those who have been adversely affected by Gagetown's harmful chemical use. I joined the Canadian Armed Forces less than 3 months before my 18th birthday. I served my country just shy of 3.5 years. I was stationed at CFB Gagetown, and I served with the 2nd Battalion Black Watch and was remustered to the Royal Canadian Regiment in the last year of my service. As an infantry soldier, I spent weeks at a time in the training area and on all ranges. We dug and lived in trenches, sometimes for days, and we crawled on our bellies through the chemically saturated training area. During the summer training, during the summer training, there was always dust, which we would be inhaling. All of the training area and ranges were repeatedly sprayed with 2,4-D, 2,4,5-T, Toradon 101, and Toradon 10K. These chemicals mixtures were better known as Agent Orange, Agent Purple, and Agent White. These highly toxic chemicals were vastly distributed over 181,038 acres at CFB Gagetown's training area. Successive federal governments and D&D would have you believe that only 2.5 barrels of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T and Toradon herbicides the Americans sprayed on Gagetown was the only time highly toxic herbicides were ever sprayed on Gagetown. D&D's own document, A-2004-0027, that D&D said was lost through the passage of time, shows, I'm losing my headset, shows that D&D sprayed 6,504 barrels off the exact same highly toxic chemicals between 1956 and 1984 that the Americans sprayed on Vietnam. The truth is successive federal governments and D&D sprayed more of these highly toxic chemicals per acre at CFB Gagetown than the American military sprayed per acre in Vietnam during that entire war. On January 24th, 1985, D&D briefed the New Brunswick Cabinet on the use of defoliants at CFB Gagetown, a transcript of which is found on pages 75 to 90 on D&D's document A-2004-00207, acquired through ATIP. This document contained 167 pages, but 85 pages were not released. We'd like to see those pages. During the briefing, Major M. Rushton admitted that by 1964, the government and D&D were concerned by the presence of dioxin in 2,4,5-T. He stated, at that time, the government's knowledge of the chemicals they were using and their effects on humans and the environment was limited. 2,4,5-T is the source of the dioxin. At the same briefing on January 24th, 1985, Mr. Walter stated in 1983, Defense Headquarters became concerned over the potential for environmental damage due to the migration and persistence of picloram, the main ingredient in Tordon pellets. Several other defense establishments show that some migration of these chemicals occur in very sandy soil. This statement alone challenges the federal government's and DND's assurance that these chemicals were never sprayed at any other military base in Canada. The Canadian government, the New Brunswick cabinet, and DND knew as early as 1964 of the toxic and persistent nature of these chemicals, and yet they said nothing. They did nothing that could have prevented further exposure, sickness, diseases, and yes, even death. Dr. Dworenchuk, probably the foremost authority on these forever toxic chemicals, has stated it to the news media repeatedly that it makes no difference if these chemicals were registered for use in Canada. They never should have been sprayed. He said dioxin can last 100 years in the soil, and soldiers training in the training area and civilians in the surrounding area would have been adversely affected. He said exposure to these chemicals can alter our DNA, and this can be passed on from 7 to 10 generations. Dr. Meg Sears has presented that the Gagetown fact-finding project was seriously flawed and that the base Gagetown is still contaminated. The Canadian government and DND hired the chemical industry itself to carry out the health risk assessment of Gagetown's harmful chemical use, and they called that an independent and impartial study. Our government then hired that company's founder to head up the peer review of that company's work at Gagetown. This, in my opinion, is a conflict of interest and clearly illustrates the need for a fully independent public inquiry into the fallacy they call fact-finding. It is the hopes of the brats in the battlefield that the convening of this long-standing committee...
Can you wind up your presentation? You're well past your 5 minutes.
I am sorry.
That's all right. That's right. It's just...
Okay. What we hope to accomplish here is to advance the interests of the Gagetown's veterans and their families and the civilians living in Gagetown's surrounding area, obtain full compensation for those harmed by the use of carcinogenic defoliants at Gagetown, engage the federal government's public position on the use of defoliants at Gagetown, which the brats in the battlefield view as intentionally misleading. Seek the full acknowledgement from the federal government that the millions and liters of kilograms of defoliants were sprayed at Gagetown from 1956 to this present day, that the federal government and Veteran Affairs Canada immediately embrace and adopt all aspects of the U.S. PACT Act in regards to Canadian military being exposed to harmful chemicals.
Leave it there. Mr. Good, we're going to have to leave it there. You're well past your time. That's all right. You can work that back in when members start asking you questions. Dr. Salisbury, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to address the vital issue of safeguarding the health of Canada's military personnel through a population health approach to environmental hazards. My name is David Salisbury. I served in the Canadian Forces Medical Services for over 28 years. After initial work as a general duty medical officer and flight surgeon, I completed a master's degree in occupational health, earned board certification in the U.S. as well as Royal College Fellowship in Canada in aerospace medicine and community medicine. For 5 years, I was the commanding officer of the Canadian Forces Environmental Medical Establishment in Toronto. And along with Lieutenant Greg Cook, I designed and implemented the revamped Directorate of Force Health Protection within the Health Services branch in the early 2000s. I retired from the Canadian Forces in 2004 as the director of that organization to move into civilian life as a medical officer of health of the City of Ottawa. It has been more than 20 years since I wore the uniform, but my interest in occupational medicine and public health and my concern for the health of our men and women in uniform has not waned. Today I will focus on the health threats our troops face, particularly those stemming from toxic environmental hazards, both on the modern battlefield and at home in garrison. These threats, alongside infectious diseases and industrial exposures, directly impact our military's operational readiness and the long-term health outcomes of all DND personnel, both those in the CF and civilian employees of DND. First, allow me to set the context. Historically, disease and environmental hazards have caused more casualties and impaired military operations more than combat itself. From the impact of trench fever in World War I to the devastating effects of malaria during World War II's Burma campaign, and now the widespread respiratory illnesses linked to burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan, the lesson is clear. Prevention is as important as combat training. Protecting our troops requires us to anticipate and address health threats inherent to modern conflict environments, as well as those present in our domestic military facilities. The modern battlefield and Canadian bases, which are essentially miniature industrial sites, present new and complex health challenges. It has been estimated by some that more than 10 million new chemicals and chemical formulations are introduced into the environment each year. Canada assesses approximately 450 new substances annually under the new Substances Notification Regulations of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. The human health risks of most of these substances remain unknown or poorly understood. Today's military operations often occur in regions where environmental hazards are amplified by human action. For example, depleted uranium and other heavy metals in armor-piercing munitions pose long-term risks of cancer and other diseases. The destruction of industrial facilities during combat releases hazardous chemicals such as benzene and asbestos, which contaminate air, soil, and water. Modern weaponry and vehicles often use advanced composites and metals, which release toxic fumes upon destruction or combustion. Burn pits, commonly used to dispose of waste in war zones, emit carcinogenic toxins linked to respiratory illnesses, cancers, and other chronic conditions. Solvents, fuels used in modern and operating modern weapon systems contain substances known to be neurotoxic or substances so new that their health impacts are largely unknown. These environmental risks compound the traditional health challenges of deployment. But we must also recognize the threats closer to home. Garrisons are in many ways miniature industrial complexes. The day-to-day work of maintaining vehicles, aircraft, and ships, I threw the ships in because I heard Mr. Talmey's reference to the Navy. I have not served with the Navy. Sorry, I lost myself. Involve handling hazardous materials. Training exercises expose personnel to industrial risks that are often poorly documented. For example, long-term exposure to solvents, fuels, and heavy metals can lead to chronic health conditions if not properly mitigated. The CF has long had a preventive medicine capability, traditionally focused on infectious disease and hazards such as noise and physical injury. But since the early 2000s, significant progress has been made in addressing the additional toxic risks of the modern battlefield and, to some extent, domestic operations. The creation of force health protection and the deployment of industrial hygienists have been crucial steps forward in preventing disease in our forces. Pre-deployment assessments now include environmental and occupational health evaluations, a practice that was undoubtedly prevented countless exposures and illnesses. These are commendable advancements and lay a strong foundation for the next phase of health protection, the ongoing assessment and documentation of industrial exposures at home and abroad. This issue is not just about immediate or long-term health
Dr.
risk.
Salisbury?
Wrap it up?
Yes, please.
Okay, to conclude, I urge this committee to continue prioritizing health protection as a cornerstone of our defense strategy, enhancing preventive measures, strengthening health surveillance systems, investing in research and innovation, formally recognizing that veterans can and do develop occupation diseases long after their service, and considering the designation of presumptive diagnosis as mentioned in by the previous two speakers in the PACT Act. By building on this progress over the next 2 decades, over the past 2 decades, and adopting a comprehensive population health approach, we can ensure that the Canadian Forces remain resilient, operationally capable, and above all, cared for. Thank you. I look forward to your Q&A.
I'd like to run 3 rounds if we can. We have 2 hours, well, whatever we got left of 2 hours. So we'll start with a 6-minute round and then see where we go from there. Mr. Talmey, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses, and Mr. Salisbury, thank you very much for your service to our country. Appreciate you being here and being in person, and to our guests who are online. A couple of questions that I'd like to start off with, and Ms. Beauchamp, I appreciate your testimony. Appreciate you being here. As a child, how many bases did you live on? When we say brats, base brats, terminology is obviously...
You're on mute again.
I lived in Halifax, Wainwright, Gagetown, London, Ontario, and in Ottawa, and I'm still in Ottawa. So.
Okay, thank you. So while I still have you, we've heard from other witnesses from the Treasury Board, Health Environment Canada, and they've talked about the EPA list and about the list of chemicals that are on the list that are hazardous and of concern. And I asked them, you know, had they included chemicals that maybe the military's used, and we kind of got a vague answer. But in your testimony, you mentioned that the lists did not contain all the chemicals, and obviously you've read the list. It's my understanding. Have you read the list?
I've read the list that is in the fact-finding project and what was sprayed. We have a document that states what was sprayed in Gagetown, and it somewhat differed from what they focused on in the fact-finding project. So they had a tendency to focus on Agent Orange alone, but there were other substances, whether sprayed separately or individually, they didn't concentrate on. So there was 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T that was sprayed numerous years, I think 56, 57, 58, 59. Those two chemicals mixed together actually are the mixture of Agent Orange. So they were actually spraying well before 66 and 67. There was also Toradon, I think it's called 101, which is a liquid dioxin. There's also Toradon 10K, which are pellets that were sprayed. So there's a huge list, and in my brief, I linked to one of the documents that they identify all of the toxins, but they don't, or the substances that they sprayed, but they don't actually focus on all of them. Where the problem lies is with some of these chemicals, from what I have read and researched, is with the mixtures of Agent Orange, Agent White, and Agent Purple, which is what was sprayed, and Gary can talk more to that because he understands it a little bit better than I do. But there's what's called a TCDD component. It's a byproduct, and that's where there's a dioxin that's more toxic than just the 2,4-D and the 2,4,5-T alone.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that answer. And I will transfer over to Mr. Good. Thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Good, I understand that you presented to a Maine Commission on Agent Orange. Could you share a little bit about what their reaction was, and can Canada learn from anything that they're doing down there?
Yes, I'd be happy to. The Maine's Commission study into Gagetown's harmful chemical use was spearheaded by Senator, the President of the Maine Senate, Troy Jackson. I provided that commission with DND's own document that I alluded to in my intro, which clearly points out the quantity of chemicals sprayed, when, where, how much. It was voted unanimously in their legislature at the ending that they wanted to carry this on, and they wanted to move forward with that commission study. Unfortunately, the governor at that time, she was a stickler on details, and she wouldn't sign up to 40-some applications for different things, and that just happened to be one of them to move forward. But there's a good chance it will move forward in the near future. Mr. Jackson is running for governor. So if he gets that, definitely it'll be moving forward.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask the same question that I asked Ms. Beauchamp, pardon me. Have you read the list that is out regarding chemicals and that are on the EPA list? And have you noticed anything that is not on the list that you feel should be on the list?
I have not read the list as extensively as Eileen has read it. However, dioxins 2378 is called 2378T, is highly polluted with dioxins. 245T is highly polluted with that particular chemical. It's highly toxic. It can remain in the soil for 100 years or longer, and it can be passed on, cause genetic damage, and can be passed on from 7 to 10 generations, according to Dr. Dworenchuk.
We're unfortunately, I apologize to all of the witnesses. I appreciate it's particularly difficult when you can't see the chair, but I have to keep kind of a handle on the time here, or other people get mad at me. Madame Lambropoulos, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here to answer some of our questions today. I really appreciate you opening up about these issues and having the courage to come here today. It's not easy to talk about this. Mr. Good, towards the end of my 6 minutes, I'd like to give you an opportunity to finish your opening remarks, because I know you had some specific recommendations that you had started citing, and I'd like to give you a minute to finish those. But I'll start with some questions. My first question is for Ms. Beauchamp. You said that, you spoke about the issues that your family has faced because of the, exposure to contaminated sites, being on contaminated sites. And you at one point mentioned a sunset clause for some of the benefits that people could receive if they had been affected. Can you explain a little bit more? And you said that those people basically who would get affected or whose symptoms would start to develop after 2011 would no longer get those benefits. Can you explain a little bit more and give a recommendation perhaps specifically to that point?
I'll use myself as a case here. I was diagnosed with 3 cancers in 2017. I opted for certain medical procedures or complementary medicine. I had nowhere to go except use my own money. Based on what was stated from Veterans Affairs, there was a statement made saying that Veterans Affairs only compensates and provides benefits to veterans. The ex gratia payment that was provided in 2011 also included veterans plus civilians plus family members. So that, to me, was an inaccurate statement. So because there was a sunset clause, so the last payments that could be issued through the ex gratia was December 30th or 31st, 2011. So there was no way to apply for any compensation after that date. Where I see a problem is some illnesses and some cancers are diagnosed later on. So non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is generally diagnosed after the age of 60. So when they did their study in the fact-finding project, they never took into account long-term illnesses. So currently, there's really no recourse for any civilian member, whether it be an employee of National Defense, whether it be a family member of a veteran, or a community member that may have been affected, especially with the dioxins at Gagetown. Because when I was growing up there, many individuals and many family members, we recreationed where they sprayed. We fished in the brooks. We drank the spring water. We ate the blueberries. I mean, we burnt fire in the wintertime. So throughout my life, I had many illnesses, and I lost a child at 3 days after birth at the age of 20. And I had endometriosis and I had colitis. And how does one person end up with all those illnesses? And then at the age of 61, I end up being diagnosed with 3 separate cancers, not related at all. So compensation, I think there needs to be some brainstorming to identify a framework that will help those who have been exposed to toxic chemicals, including even the ones today like the PFAS.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
How many minutes do I have left? A minute and a half. Okay. So another question I want answered, but I also want to give some time to Mr. Good is, although health services are provincial, and actually not although, but because they are, what recommendations would you like the provincial government to implement as it relates to health services for people affected by harmful chemicals on contaminated sites? I guess I'll give the floor to Mr. Good, and maybe he can, I don't know if you have any answers to that question, but maybe you can work in your recommendations as well into that answer.
Well, I'm definitely not a medical expert, but being New Brunswick, I mean, they knew as early as 1964 of the toxic and persistent nature of the chemicals that were being sprayed at Gagetown as early as 1964, and yet they did nothing. So I think it's vitally important that they seriously look at the history, their history of denial, and then that they move forward. We're ready to sit down and talk to them and help bring this to closure that's beneficial to everyone, both New Brunswick, the other provinces, and the government. When it comes to health care, yes, I understand there's a bit of an issue between the federal and the provincial, and I personally don't know how they're going to get around that. But obviously there has to be a mutual agreement that's beneficial to the citizens of their respective provinces.
We're going to have to leave it there. Monsieur Simard, 6 minutes.
You have 6 minutes, Mr. Simard.
You're set to that, or reply to him en français?
Merci. Vous m'entendez?
Thank you. Can you hear me? For the witnesses, are you able to hear me? You're using the interpreter? Very good. Thank you. I will begin with you, Ms. Beauchamp. I have questions about the process through which illnesses are recognized. You have said in your testimony, you mentioned the clause, the Sunset Clause, 2011, and in the undertaking that you've been involved in, when you were diagnosed by your medical professional, by your doctor, what did you do to be recognized by DND as having a professional illness due to exposure or related to service or exposure?
Because I recognize that there were no more applications, and it was stated right on the website, actually, because I follow the government's websites as well, that there would be no more payments after 2011. So I did not apply. So, and given that I had 3 cancers, I was not in a position to physically or mentally to even go that route. But instead, I decided to advocate after I finished my treatment.
Je comprends. Je comprends.
Very well, I understand. I understand that quite clearly, but there is no means, I mean, what I'm looking for and what I would like your help with is understanding whether there is a means available currently that would allow you to have this diagnosis of an illness related to surface or exposure recognized by DND. Right now, there's no specific path for that, no path to support from DND for you?
No, there isn't.
OK. Parfait. Et vous avez un diagnostic.
Very good, thanks. And your diagnosis, of course, was made by a professional, a doctor, I suppose. And I imagine you have data to the effect and a diagnosis to the effect that it is likely that your exposure probably to these chemical elements have created this health issue for you.
Here's where some of the difficulty is confusing. I was diagnosed here in Ottawa. Where the confusion lies is when you mention to any physician, well, I grew up in Gagetown, New Brunswick, where they sprayed Agent Orange and Agent White and Agent Purple. They look at you with a very confused face. So where I see the problem is that there's not recognition of illnesses for exposure. And I believe that would be nationally within Canada. There would be very few provincial governments who have a list of exposures. And it's basically very similar in VAC and DND because the lists are not cohesive either. So perhaps that's what needs to be worked on is a cohesive list of illnesses and diseases related to exposures.
Savez, je trouve ça fort.
You know, I find this truly surprising, very disturbing. I'm from the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, where we have an employer, Rio Tinto. It used to be Alcan, and we know that there are several illnesses that are linked to exposure to material in those plants, cancer, for example. But they have like a form which allows medical professionals, physicians to know what they might have been exposed to in the aluminum plants and that can be linked to certain types of cancers. What you're telling me is that National Defense, the Department of National Defense, doesn't have a framework for recognizing illnesses that that prior military personnel can develop that are linked to exposure.
It doesn't appear to be. And it appears from talking with Ms. Zimmerman, because we've collaborated with certain things, is something that was noticed was that DND follows the ILO, which is the International Labor Organization, their illnesses, and Veterans Affairs has a separate list. So I guess what I'm communicating here today is that perhaps it is time to have a cohesive list that everyone is following so that when people are diagnosed, then it's more recognized.
Je serais tout à fait intéressé.
I would be highly interested in that. Could you provide us with the list of measures that you have tried to have your illness recognized and perhaps the services that you were unable to access? But I would also like to ask you, sir, Mr. Salisbury, as a medical professional, whether it's possible for the Department of National Defense to specify what illnesses may be linked to exposure to chemicals, such that service members who have been exposed to such products have some recourse related to their presumptive diagnoses related to professional service. I think this could be useful.
Unfortunately, Mr. Samar has left you no time to answer it, but maybe there was an opportunity in the future. Madame Matheson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you to the witnesses for appearing with us today. Mr. Goods, Ms. Beauchamp, in both of your briefing notes to the committee, and thank you for giving them to us in advance, you reference different ATIPs, access to information studies and documents that show the disconnect between the Furlong Commission findings and then the government's public statements and then verified factual evidence. Can you table these with these documents with the committee so that we have the clear pathways on that? Just a yes, sir.
Sorry.
It's your
What do you need to-
documentation. It's the documentation that you had referred to with the ATIPs and the documents that you have. Can you
okay.
submit those
I'll
to the
let
committee?
Gary talk to that because a lot of the ATIP documents were part of the fact finding, or I shouldn't say the fact finding, occurred in 2004 when there was another group at that time who had solicited the government for ATIP documentations. I've read them, but Gary was the one who worked with the group that obtained them. You're on mute, Gary.
Yes, I can comment on that. Yeah, that document, that was D&D's own document, like I said earlier. They lost through the passage of time and didn't present to the Base Gagetown and Area Fact Finding Project. However, a lovely lady with the Agent Orange Association of Canada found it, no problem. It was presented at the theater at CFB Gagetown when they had the town hall explaining to the community members of Oromocto and Gagetown that there was only 2.5 barrels over a 7-day period, 66 and 67. But then again, Kenneth Dobie, who at that time was the president of the Agent Orange Association, he stepped up to the microphone and he clearly stated what was sprayed when and how much. And if you go by D&D's own documents, that document, it's in there exactly where they sprayed, when they sprayed, how much they sprayed. And it's not a lie, it's not an exaggeration that there was actually more of these chemicals sprayed at CFB Gagetown per acre than was sprayed in Vietnam during that entire war. This is not fallacy.
Okay. I think having these documents with the committee would be helpful for the study for sure. Mr. or Dr. Salisbury, I would like to shift to you to ask, you highlighted in your opening remarks that disease and environmental hazards have caused more casualties than combat itself. That's incredible. In last week's testimony, we heard from civilian employees and veterans from Moose Jaw. We heard that the base had failed to resolve the known contaminations or even inform individuals directly impacted, and we heard about the devastating impacts that this has had since the centralization of Canadian Forces Real Property Operation Group, the ADM, i.e., they oversee contamination sites on D&D land, but the day-to-day monitoring and the management of those individual sites is delegated to base commanders, wing commanders, environment officers. These are uniformed officers that are outside the chain of command and of the ADM. So from your experience, can you talk about that as being maybe a problem, or what do you see as in terms of that disconnect that exists?
Thank you very much for the question. I actually had the pleasure of serving in Moose Jaw for 3 years. I was a Snowbirds flight surgeon for 3 years, in 83 to 86. And I would have to say it's actually when this issue came to the fore, I was astounded because as the base surgeon in Moose Jaw, I had no knowledge whatsoever of there being contaminated sites present at that time. Now that was in the 80s, and I must admit we've moved forward on how we think about that. And for me, the problem is the disconnect between all the different parties that could be affected. So we have 3 groups on any given base that can be affected. There's the uniformed members, there's the civilian employees, and then there's the families, many of whom live on the base or the base environs. They do not have an integrated medical provision system. Uniformed personnel receive their medical care from uniformed or now contract doctors. Civilian employees are responsible to get their own health care in the local area. They are supposed to be watched by occupational health from Health Canada, but given the numbers, that's probably not going to happen very efficiently because there's small numbers of employees, and you're not going to dedicate a occupational health physician or even an occupational health nurse to 60, 70, even 200 employees. It's not within the resources of the department. And last but not least, the poor families. Else bumped around with me for 29 years and went through so many different doctors, we can't keep track of them all. I had 11 different postings in 11 different places. My medical documents follow me when I go from one posting to another. The family, that doesn't happen. And every province has its own system.
Okay, we go to our second 5-minute round. Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. From your record, are there currently still discarded Agent Orange barrels disposed on Base Gagetown? Anyone? No one knows?
They say there's no. They say there's not. Salim Satter, he's been out looking for them when they're reported, and there has been chemicals found, but in some of the barrels, but I don't think they've really amounted to much in the way of how they reported it. So it's hard to say if there's still some buried out there. I'm sure there is somewhere, but I don't think they're coming forward with it.
Okay, Ms. Beauchamp, so have you aligned, being able to align chronologically the times of spraying with the times that your family was posted to Gagetown? How closely do those align or coincide?
Well, based on one of the appendix, I attached an appendix to my brief, and that lists the dates and what was sprayed and how much was sprayed. So the years it gives it. So I was there when a lot of dioxin was sprayed, including the DDT. That was
Okay, so are we're focusing on Agent Orange, I believe, but DDT is definitely
no. We need to focus on all of the chemicals. It's not just Agent Orange.
All right. So, to the best of your knowledge, is there any reagent that can be used to neutralize or to chelate the offending chemicals that are still lingering, perhaps, in the soil?
Probably the best person to ask is on Thursday when Meg Sears will be speaking. I don't know if Gary can answer that question. I'm not sure.
So how old were you when the Agent Orange or dioxins were dispersed in Gagetown?
I moved there when I was 5 years old, and I left when I was 12 years old.
Did they disperse it aerially, or was it sprayed on the ground? How was it applied to the land?
I think the majority was by air. Gary can answer whether any was sprayed by hand on the land. I'm not sure.
Okay. So I haven't been to Gagetown. Are there any rivers, streams, little lakes on the property?
Well, that's where we used to fish, is where the spraying was. So it was when I first went to Gagetown, military families were allowed to go in the back where all military personnel, so the soldiers, would train and rifle ranges, maneuvers, or whatever. And so families were allowed to go fishing back there, to pick blueberries back there, to drink spring water wherever we wanted. It was carte blanche. I mean, it wasn't just families, too. There were cadets from across this country.
So what about wildlife? We know that the DDT wiped out the eagles in southern Ontario for quite a while. What about the fish and the eggs of any waterfowl, were there any observations that the wildlife had been impacted?
I can't say for animals, but for fish, I never noticed any, but because we ate all the fish too, and that was something that was in the report, that they removed the skin of the fish. Well, it's well known in the scientific community, when you remove the skin of the fish, dioxins accumulate in the fat cells. So once you remove the skin, you've removed the fat. So that was flawed within that study. The amounts of dioxin in the fish was inaccurate.
So no observed obvious deformities.
No, not at
they,
the time.
they say that Maine's state legislature released a report calling D&D's investigation to Agent Orange at Gagetown biased and flawed. Can you elaborate as to how this statement was arrived at? Anyone?
I don't know how it was arrived at. I know there were, on Prevent Cancer Now website, there are investigative documents that identify where the fact-finding project is most likely flawed. Part of that has to do with the counts that they did for the epidemiology studies. They actually included, for the health outcomes, they included the exposed personnel with the non-exposed, and they also, from what I read, included all of Fredericton, which Fredericton was pretty far away at that time.
Unfortunately, again, I'm going to have to move on. I apologize. Mr. Collins, 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses this afternoon. Mr. Salisbury, I'll start with you, and thank you for your service, sir. You talked about poor documentation, and both of the other witnesses, Ms. Beauchamp and Mr. Good, talked about incidents and actions that would have occurred back in the 1950s and 1960s. I shared an experience with the committee at our first meeting where, as a former municipal councillor, we were dealing with the federal government, Transport Canada, in terms of assuming airport lands in our municipality. We found the evidence of PFAS, and then it was a big fight in terms of trying to secure compensation for the local municipality related to the cleanup costs. And part of the battle and struggle was to secure proper documentation to prove our case. And that, without breaching confidentiality, we had to seek out people who used to work at the airport and who provided testimony that, in fact, that did occur, and that was part of their job duty. How do we deal with the whole issue of poor documentation as it relates to, in this instance, issues that go back to the 1950s and 60s? And I'm asking you that question because you piqued my interest when you talked about being a former medical officer of health with the City of Ottawa, and you would certainly know the whole issue as it relates to freedom of information requests and the ATIPs that have been mentioned here today. So do you have any recommendations along those lines?
Well, for individuals, it's going to be extremely difficult. And one of the parts that I didn't get to in my brief because I was too long-winded, sorry about that, Chair, is that we really need to adapt a different mindset, specifically when we're talking about historical exposures. We're not going to find what people were exposed to, and we're not going to be able to test them to be able to say, oh yeah, you were exposed to this, and we now know that. We're going to have to work on the basis of what is referred to very succinctly in the PACT Act in the United States as presumptive diagnoses. That is, you got this diagnosis, we know you were in such and such an area, we're going to put those two together, and we're just going to presume that it was caused by that. Physicians as a whole, I would say we're not very interested in causality for the most part. We diagnose people, we treat them for their diseases, and we move on. Causality is a very nebulous, in some ways, concept, and it's also extremely difficult to prove. There's something in epidemiology called attributable risk fraction. So I'll quickly give you an example. We know that asbestos, for example, causes lung cancer. not the thing that everyone talks about, which is mesotheliomas. That's a done deal. If you got a mesothelioma, we know that's because of asbestos, because it's about the only cause. But if you've got lung cancer and you're a pack-a-day smoker, all right, or you worked in a bar where you were exposed to secondhand smoke, I have no idea how much do I say was caused by your smoking habit, how much was caused by the fact that you worked in a smoky bar, how much was caused by you being exposed to asbestos in your work. There is no scientific, there is no medical way to tease those things out. So we have to, for historical purposes, work on a presumptive diagnosis and presume that people who were exposed, we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt, and we're going to look after them from that point of view. Going forward, I guess there might be some hope that electronic health records will solve some of this. We also need to make sure, though, that those electronic health records can talk to each other, which is a huge problem. I think in Ontario there are 12 different vendors of electronic health records, and those electronic health records don't talk to each other, even though they're supposed to all meet the same standard, which is, by the way, is HL7. It's the international standard for communicating health information electronically. So I think that's part of the solution. The other part is to really, I think we need to tighten up on looking after the families. You know, it really is a bit of I don't know if I'd call it a shame, but it's certainly a real hole in our system that we don't look after the families of uniformed members because they're moving with the same amount as the members are. And up until...
Apologize for cutting people off. Well, Dr. Salisbury, if you consider yourself long-winded, you've come to the right committee. Yeah. Mr. Simard.
Merci. Est-ce que
2.5 minutes, please.
Je vais vous laisser.
Thank you. I'll give you a moment, Mr. Salisbury, to put on your earpiece. You can hear me? Yes, thank you. Thank you for your explanation about causality. We often think of physicians as treating people, but we don't often enough think of causes of illness, do we? So if the Department of National Defense has trouble recognizing professional illnesses of service members or service-related illnesses, then it seems that we don't have an accurate picture of reality. How can we act on this? I'm taking Ms. Beauchamp's situation as an example. What can we do with the department to treat and support people suffering from illnesses linked to exposure to chemical products? I understand, of course, that once you're a veteran, it's difficult to get a diagnosis proving that your presumptive diagnosis is related to service or exposure, but isn't there a gap in this regard? A gap in data available to the department to make decisions about this?
Thank you. Merci pour votre question.
Thank you for your question.
Respond in French because my hearing aids have made me very difficult to understand French directly. Yes, I believe there is a gap, and I think the gap exists between it's both bureaucratic, but it's also scientific. We don't. I'll take my own example. All right, I had 11 different postings in a 28-year career. In at least 3 of those postings, I had 4 offices. So how are you going to document all of the exposures that I possibly had? Not to mention the inadvertent ones I had from doing aircraft accident investigations, where I was dealing with the combustion products of an aircraft fire. or the 6 months I spent in Croatia where nothing was documented. So it's very difficult for us to put two and two together. And if we demand causation proof, then we're going to under care for the people who've got illnesses.
Mr. Zamar, 2.5 minutes. Ms. Masson.
So on that line, I guess one of the questions that I had for Veterans Affairs, Dr. Salisbury, was not understanding why they weren't ultimately doing that, seeing that there were these large issues of toxins and so on, and not just attributing that presumptive what was it you called, the presumptive diagnosis. There also there was an explanation from them that the reason they didn't follow more of that American model on the under the PACT Act was that in the States, Veterans Affairs has its own direct health administration. I'm not sure if I buy that, and I would love your opinion on that, considering if a government decides that they're going to treat this with seriousness, that they would treat it with all seriousness. What would you have to say on that regard?
Well, I don't think we can create in Canada something similar to the VA in the United States. I mean, this is an enormous health delivery organization. It's actually bigger than the military itself in its provision of services. But I think it's not right to say that we can't use presumptive diagnosis as a guide to who we're going to provide care for and who we're going to look after. I think we could come up with our own version in Canada of what we believe to be places that are worthy of that consideration, and a list of diagnoses to go with it. We have lots of research around the world. The ILO list that the previous witnesses have mentioned is a good starting point, but it's also buried in or right integral to the PACT Act of what are the presumptive diagnoses and what exposures that the VA in the United States is prepared to currently compensate and deal with. And there's no reason why we couldn't just borrow it 100%. I don't see any harm in doing that. We spend too much time fighting about compensation, and too much time, in my view, we spend too much time. We've devised an adversarial system, and it shouldn't be an adversarial system. That may work in law, but it doesn't work in medicine, and so I think we need to go there.
Thank you. Sorry, I keep cutting you off. Ms. Stewart, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I was thinking about this as a bit of a statistical exercise in some regards, too, to figure things out. And in a perfect world, if we could have a box, like a computer box, and put in all the illnesses that have been diagnosed, the sites where people have lived and worked and served, the list of ILO chemicals, the jobs, length of time people were in places, and some other factors we could come up with. Can we not then, feed that into a computer with some AI and come up with some relationships that would allow us to put a pretty darn good estimate on maybe not causation, but a relationship amongst those factors that would allow us to assign some responsibility?
So I'll just give you an example. The ILO document is a 620-page document. It actually has already done that for you. It has linked. It actually links it by exposure and then what diagnoses they consider to be occupational diseases or occupationally related to that. Now, you can't, as I indicated earlier, you can't just blindly accept that because, as I said, there's the attributable risk issue of, well, okay, it's estimated that 45 to 50% of Canadians will develop cancer. Will not, and of course we are all exposed to environmental hazards, but how are we going to tease that out? I really think the issue needs to be that we provide care and we look after the people who are sick, and we stop arguing about, I know this will be unsatisfactory for some people, but we need to stop arguing about causation, and we need to start concentrating on care for people who are sick and not have them battle the bureaucracy about compensation and owning up to some responsibility. That is only wasting a lot of resources, which could be better spent on providing the care to the patients who need it.
I'm wondering about these chemicals. They have a persistence for quite some length of time. What's going on the defense sites now in those locations where we have these chemicals exposed to the ground?
Well, you're way out of my, sorry, you're way out of my wheelbox on that one.
Okay.
I haven't been in the uniform for 20 years, so.
Right. Well, thank you for your service as well. How much outreach do we know, and maybe this is a question for Gary or Eileen, what kind of outreach has D&D offered to talk to you about the exposure to chemicals and what might have been, what you might have been exposed to in the past, and what concentrations and where and when and how long?
I can answer that question. We've had Zoom meetings with Salim Sattar, the Director General for Environment and Sustainability for D&D. He started off giving us a PowerPoint type presentation on 66 and 67 and the 2.5 barrels that the Americans sprayed there in 66 and 67 over a 7-day period, and did not mention or allude to the fact that D&D itself, sprayed 6,504 barrels of the exact same chemicals, starting back as early as 1956. We asked him about that.
Does D&D come to you and say, you may be concerned about this because we've got X number of people who developed such and such illnesses that are in the same spots you were?
No, they have not done that. And actually, the Base Gauge Down and Area Fact-Finding Project was, in my opinion, was pretty well designed to focus entirely on 66 and 67 and the 2.5 barrels that the Americans sprayed, and totally didn't disregard the fact that they sprayed other chemicals, but they did not come forward with the amounts of chemicals that they did spray, what those chemicals were. For example, in 1956, they sprayed...
left. I got one other question for you. Are you collaborating with any other organizations to conduct research?
No, I'm not collaborating with any other organizations to conduct research. You'd have to elaborate on which organizations you might be referring to.
Just an open-ended question.
Yeah, Mr. Stewart's going to have to elaborate in some other manner. Final question, Mr. Pawlowski, 5 minutes for this round.
So, Dr. Salisbury, before I started working here, I had a real job as a doctor. Anyhow, I agree. Like, as a doctor, you don't worry about causality. I mean, who cares? Somebody's got cancer. But certainly what we do here, and this goes far beyond this particular subject of the military, but every day people get cancer. As you say, 40%, whatever numbers there are, people will get cancer. Certainly we know that certain things in the environment may lead to cancer, but as a government, as you regulate industry, as you regulate the military, as you and we do have to, if it's government money, we have to worry about the public purse. But but the real issue would seem to be like how far we go in trying to link up an exposure to an actual outcome, and to bear the financial obligations that come with that, whether it's we as a government or private businesses, but we as the government set the rules, right? So this is, I think, increasingly and ought to be an issue for governments is how to attribute risk, how far we go in trying to link up an outcome with the causality, and this seems like a monumental problem. But looking at specifically with the issue before us, has the military looked at and examined people who lived in different places at different times? For example, we've heard here about Gagetown. Have they looked at whether people who've served in Gagetowns from any particular period of time have a higher risk of, for example, certain kinds of cancer?
I wouldn't know the answer to that, certainly not during my time at Force Health Protection. That single question would be a monumental epidemiological study.
I wonder if perhaps there isn't a little bit of an answer to this. If we have the records, we know who served where. We also have the epidemiological records as to who gets what kind of cancers. Certainly in the old days, which was like a year ago, it would take a monumental effort to try to match those up. But with AI, I mean, is there efforts within the public health world of using the computer strength of AI to kind of match those things up to say, yes, that if you've served in Gagetown between this year and that year, that they have a statistically 50% higher chance of developing bladder cancer or something?
Well, that would be how you would do the study, but I mean, the issue will be, okay, so now we're talking, if we just date it from the date of the supposed exposure, or sorry, not the supposed, the exposure that has been acknowledged of Agent Orange in 1966 and 67, all right? So now we're talking, that would be 60 plus years times an average number of people in the armed forces of between 90 and 100,000, with changing cohorts of who's in that group, with varying amounts of exposure, some not exposed at all, some exposed. I mean, it is a huge puzzle. It's doable. And certainly AI is coming to the fore in public health in doing those kinds of studies if the documents are digitalized, which they may or may not be. And then you've got the whole issue, of course, if you want to get back to an individual, you've got a privacy issue and you've got to deal with that if you're going to run a study. So I'm not going to say it's not doable, but I wonder if the amount of effort would be worth the benefit that you would get out of it, as opposed to saying, let's just say that people who are there at such and such a time, if they have such and such a diagnosis, we're going to look after them. It would be much simpler, and I don't think, a lot of compensation law. I mean, we're bad-mouthing D&D, but this is true of workers' compensation writ large, all right? All our workers' compensation systems are set up on an adversarial basis, right? Now,
sorry again.
Yeah.
Seems like all I do is interrupt and say sorry. Yes, it's rude. I feel badly. I also feel badly that the bells start ringing at 5:52, and the consequence of that is that, and apparently they're 15-minute bells, not half-hour bells. So that pretty well means that we are going to have to wind up at 5:52. We'll go for a third round, 4 minutes, and what I have is Bazan, Lapointe, Simard, and Matheson for that 4-minute round. So if that is satisfactory, Mr. Brazan, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here. Mr. Good, I just want to touch, you said that the dioxins from Agent Orange and other pesticides that were used at Gagetown are caught up in the soil and environmental effects for the next 100 years. Are we doing soil sampling and testing of the land there to see how bad that contamination is, or do you know if National Defense is carrying out that monitoring?
Going back to the Base Gagetown Area Fact-Finding Project, there were samples taken. Yes, they stated that the majority of the levels of dioxin, for example, were mostly in the 66 and 67 area that the Americans sprayed, and also the Clones Bivouac area and Murphy's Bivouac in some ranges, which would be the rifle range, the grenade range, the rocket range. They were all sprayed repeatedly, and they were reported as high as 50, 75, and 143 times above the Canadian Council of Ministers for the Environment for dioxin in the soil. However, I personally spoke with Dr. Furlong in his office in CFB Gagetown during that fact-finding project, and he informed me himself that the Clones Bivouac area alone was 170 times above the Canadian Council of Ministers for the Environment, and not 143. What they are doing now, I have no idea what they're doing now.
Something that we want to know, especially when we have soldiers out there training, they're still digging trenches and still getting exposed then to the dioxins that are captured in that environment. So I'd asked Colonel Salisbury, knowing your former postings in places like Moose Jaw and the work that you did in Canadian Armed Forces, what can we be doing right now to ensure that our current serving members who are out on the bases across this country aren't being exposed to these toxins?
Thank you for the question. What we have to do is we have to work with essentially industrial hygiene best practices to try and prevent exposure to everything, because we can't be knowledgeable of all of the effects of the newest things that have come down the pike. So, for example, there's stuff that is being built into aircraft today, and the aircraft are being built out of what's called composite materials. What's in those composite materials? To be honest, I don't know that anybody really knows what happens, because it's an amalgam of carbon fibers and binding agents. And when you burn that, what happens? No one can conduct that experiment, right? I mean, we can't. And the other point that needs to come out of that is toxicology is based on the root. So, for example, everything is toxic in one sense or another. Wood is toxic if I aerosolize it and put it into a dust, which I can then inhale. All right? But sitting here on this table, this isn't toxic or dangerous to me other than me banging my head against it. But, so the problem is one of best practice and protection, but also tracking people through time. And then, again, I come back to presumptive diagnosis.
Roseanne, Dr. Salisbury, you wouldn't be the first person who banged his head on either on a wall or a desk around here. Ms. Lapointe,
Thank you,
4
Chair.
minutes, please.
Mr. Good, your organization has done tremendous work to raise awareness about contaminated sites and their impact on the families and communities connected with the Canadian Armed Forces. Can you tell us what challenges have you encountered in trying to advocate for solutions?
It's tedious. An example, And just recently, I applied through the Freedom of Information through Veterans Affairs and asked them how many military personnel have applied for disability pensions associated with exposure to Agent Orange and other herbicides at CFB Gagetown. They got back to me relatively pretty quick and said, sorry, we couldn't find anything. We don't have a code for Agent Orange exposure at Gagetown, or they didn't even acknowledge the other herbicides that I had mentioned. So there's an issue right there. Is okay, what are we talking about anyway? What are we trying to find out? We can't find out if they're not going to admit that, this is what the concerns are. It's not going to happen.
Okay. And based on your organization's research and the outreach efforts that you've done, what recommendations would you propose to the Department of National Defense to effectively address and remediate contaminated sites that impact the health and the well-being of military members and their families?
First, I would think that there would need to be a fully independent public inquiry into CFB Gagetown's harmful chemical use and the Base Gagetown Area Fact-Finding Project. And also, I strongly believe and recommend that the base be thoroughly investigated again and tested. During that testing time at Gagetown, when they were sampling soils, and that they only went down 4 centimeters. Dr. Dworenchuk said you start finding the more of a foot and beyond. They hauled truckloads and truckloads and truckloads of treated soil out of Moncton, New Brunswick, and they sprayed it all over parts of the training area. So how deep was that? Was that during the training, the testing period? I'm not sure of that. I've been looking for that information and I can't find it. But we will find it eventually. We need honesty. We need accountability. We need justice. And we're not here to condemn anybody. We're here to try to help come up with solutions and how we can best move forward for the betterment of everyone.
Thank you. And Dr. Salisbury, what role do you
Dr. Salisbury
play in monitoring and addressing the health risks associated with contaminated sites, and how can the Canadian Armed Forces better integrate these insights into their remediation efforts?
So on the whole, I guess I should say our profession is not particularly well trained in occupational health, I have to say. All right? It's not a core interest of the majority of doctors. The majority of doctors are interested in sickness care. The majority of doctors are interested in treating people, giving them either and doing surgery on them or giving them prescriptions and moving them out the door. And in this day and age, unfortunately, that's become even more of a problem. If you actually look at how much the Armed Forces has devoted to prevention and health care, it's actually quite substantial. Force Health Protection is an organization with, when I set it up, we had 6 serving medical officers and an additional 4 D&D doctors. That's 10 doctors for a population of 90,000. That's huge.
4 minutes, Mr. Simard.
4 minutes, Mr. Simard. Thank you very much. Dr. Salisbury, I understood the logic behind your statement that we spend too much time fighting for compensation, and we may be working from an adversarial position, and a little too much so. I'm not a specialist, of course, in medicine, but I knew there is such a thing as the precaution principle. For example, We know that asbestos can't be used because we know very well that it has very bad effects on people's health. So without necessarily backing up into sterile debate about compensation, we still have to take for granted that DND must be able to identify sites and chemicals that are problematic and that can have ill effects on health. I think this is essential work, isn't it, to protect the health of active service members now even. But how are we going to do this if we don't recognize the illnesses of veterans, of prior service members who were exposed on these sites? To your knowledge, the principle of precaution, is it taken seriously by national defense health professionals?
Yeah, thank you for your question. The application of the precautionary principle is essentially one that you assume harm or danger when you are absent absolute proof. And I think that is taken seriously by healthcare professionals. I believe it forms the basis for all of our regulatory frameworks on a vast majority of chemicals. But we also must recognize that we don't know what's coming down the pipe towards us. We also don't take into account in most of those regulatory frameworks the concept that some people are more susceptible than other people. So the most of our occupational standards, most of our drinking water standards, everything are designed around protecting the majority of the population, not around protecting everyone. Because to protect everyone would be to basically not be exposed at all.
Merci, merci. Peut-être une dernière petite.
Thank you. Perhaps one last short question for Ms. Beauchamp, perhaps addressed to Mr. Good as well. You both spoke about transparency and denial. I would like to hear you at the end of our meeting about what could be done to improve transparency and to avoid denial about exposure to chemical products in the armed services. Perhaps we could begin with Ms. Beauchamp.
You're still on mute.
Sorry again. I think data is so critical when making decisions. And having an IT background, I firmly believe that there are databases that can help the government, providing they integrate between Veterans Affairs and National Defense. I think there are data elements that they could start recording that would help them make decisions and identify outcomes for health exposure, and also inform them of how to move forward and identify what's contaminated.
Unfortunately,
today, I don't believe they're.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the answer there. Apologize again.
Merci.
I think I'll just mail in all my.
Thank you.
4 minutes before the bells start ringing.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Goods, actually, I guess this would be a follow-up in terms of that question about transparency and accountability. In the briefing note that you provided us before the meeting, you talked about problems with Cantox Environmental, a company hired to conduct the health risk assessment of Gagetown. Could you elaborate on the company's relationship with the chemical industry, and potentially talk to this committee about the guardrails needed to have a transparency accountability check on companies like that, and why?
Yes, I'd be happy to try to answer that question. At the time of the Base Gagetown Area Fact-Finding Project, Cantox Environmental was owned by Ciba Special Chemicals. They're a very large chemical company. The company was founded by ex-Health Canada employees who left Health Canada and formed for-profit companies to actually work for the government, for DND, and large industry. If you want to know a little bit more about their work, you can maybe ask Elizabeth May. They tried to sue her, but they didn't get too far with that. For her honesty, I just can't fathom the reality that our government of that day hired the chemical industry to conduct a health risk assessment of the chemicals sprayed at CFB Gagetown, and then have one of the founders of that company peer review, lead up. He was the head of the peer review of the CFB Gagetown's fact-finding project. I can't fathom that. So how are we supposed to believe what they, what they are saying? I mean, if they don't recognize the 6,504 barrels that they themselves sprayed, the exact same stuff they sprayed all over Vietnam, I mean, and they won't recognize that, what are we supposed to recognize from that fact-finding project?
If I may add to, and maybe you can ask, you've repeatedly and throughout this meeting talked about the need again to carry forward that public inquiry, particularly in the context of the Maine Commission. This has been something that's been asked for decades. It's been promised by previous governments and never fulfilled. Can you talk about why that's so important to have that public inquiry even now?
It's important to have that now to get to the bottom of, hear the facts, hear the truth. Personally, I believe the truth has been withheld. The main study, Senator Jackson himself and House Representatives himself said the fix was in. That's what he called it. The fix was in. Senator Jackson himself has stated, should we be sending our Maine National Guard there in Gagetown until we actually know what's in the soil today? We don't know what's in the soil today until we actually test it. You have Dr. Furlong state that it's 170 times to me, and then come out in the statement it's only 143 times above CCME guideline. Which is it? There's just so many unanswered questions and so many flaws in that fact-finding project. We don't know the full answer to it. And if I may, the only way to prevent sickness and disease is to get at the root cause of it in the first place. That is a treatment in itself, and we have to approach it that way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Masson. That unfortunately brings our time here to a close. Apologize for starting late, but we are subject to the votes that are going on this evening. So I want to, on behalf of the committee, thank you, Mr. Good, Ms. Beauchamp, and Dr. Salisbury for your contribution to this study, and we'll look forward to carrying it on in the reasonably near future. So with that, meeting adjourned.
Thank you.